Mia stood motionless in the kitchen, her hand clutching the counter, as the moon shone through the window. Daniel spoke in a low, nearly whispery voice behind her. "Mia, you have always been important to me, more than I ought to know." The warmth of his touch sent goosebumps down her spine, causing her breath to catch when his hand touched hers. As the distance between them vanished, she turned to face him, her heart racing. Mia never imagined that her relationship with Daniel, her stepdad, would be anything other than kind. Although he was always supportive and courteous, their relationship had remained superficial because he had married her mother when she was 16. He was the steady, reliable presence in their family, a man who kept to himself but never failed to show up when needed. However, things had begun to change over time. Daniel and Mia frequently found themselves alone in the house due to her mom's extended work hours. It started out casually, with light talk over dinner and shared giggles watching a television program. However, there had been times lately when things had lasted longer than they ought to have. Mia arrived home from her night class late one evening, wired but fatigued. In the kitchen, she discovered Daniel with a drink of whiskey and a thoughtful expression on his face. "Hard day?" she said, putting her purse aside. He nodded and gave a slight smile. "That's what you could say. There has been a lot of work lately." Mia poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "Mom's still working late?" "Yeah," Daniel said, his tone soft. "She's barely home these days." There was something in his voice that gave her pause, an edge of sadness, maybe even loneliness. "You okay?" she asked, her brow furrowing. He hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'm fine, just tired, I guess." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the air between them felt charged, as if something unspoken was hanging in the balance. A week later, the tension that had been simmering finally boiled over. It was late, and Mia was up finishing an assignment when she heard Daniel in the living room. Curious, she wandered in, finding him sitting on the couch, a book in hand. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, sitting down across from him. "Something like that," he replied, setting the book aside. They fell into an easy conversation, but as the minutes passed, the mood shifted. Daniel's gaze lingered on hers, his expression unreadable. "You've grown up so much, Mia," he said suddenly, his voice low. She laughed softly, brushing off the compliment. "Well, that's what happens over time." "No, I mean it," he insisted, his tone serious. "You've become this incredible woman. I'm proud of you." Her cheeks flushed, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. "Thanks, Daniel. That means a lot." There was a pause, the silence thick with unspoken words. Then, almost hesitantly, he said, "You know, I've always cared about you, more than I probably should." Mia's breath caught as his words sank in. "Daniel," she began, her voice trembling. "What are you saying?" He stood, pacing the room as if trying to find the right words. "I'm saying that you've become someone I can't stop thinking about. And I know it's wrong, but I can't ignore it anymore." Her heart raced as she tried to process what he was saying. We can't." "I know," he interrupted, his tone raw. "But tell me you haven't felt it too." She didn't answer, but the way her eyes dropped to the floor was all the confirmation he needed. Daniel stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. But she didn't. Instead, she looked up at him, her lips parting as she whispered, "I can't." The space between them disappeared as Daniel cupped her face, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was hesitant at first, but quickly deepened. Mia's hands gripped his shirt, pulling him closer as the intensity of their connection overwhelmed her. "You're incredible," he murmured against her lips, his hand sliding to her waist. "And your trouble," she replied, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and desire. The night unfolded in a whirlwind of passion, the boundaries between them dissolving as they gave in to what they had both been denying for so long. Every touch, every whispered word carried the weight of their forbidden connection, and neither of them could bring themselves to stop. Daniel guided her to the couch, his hands gentle but confident as he explored the curves of her body. The warmth of his touch sent shivers down her spine, and she felt her own hands instinctively reach for him, pulling him closer. The flickering light of the television cast soft shadows across the room, cocooning them in a world where only they existed. Mia stirred to the soft sound of birds outside the window. She blinked, her heart sinking as she realized she'd fallen asleep on the couch. The events of the night before came rushing back, and a wave of guilt and uncertainty washed over her. Daniel was already awake, sitting in the chair across from her, his face unreadable. "Morning," he said softly, his tone tentative. "Morning," she replied, sitting up and wrapping the blanket tighter around herself. We need to talk." "I know," he said, his gaze steady but filled with emotion. "Last night, it wasn't just a mistake, Mia. It meant something to me." Her chest tightened at his words. "But what about Mom? What about us? It can't happen again." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression pained. "I know, but I don't regret it. Not for a second." Before either of them could say more, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made Mia's stomach drop. "She's home early," she whispered, panic flashing across her face. Daniel stood quickly, running a hand through his hair. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice firm. As her mom walked through the door, greeting them with a bright smile, Mia and Daniel exchanged a fleeting glance. A silent acknowledgement of the secret they now shared. But as the days passed, the memory of that night refused to fade. And while they both vowed to move forward, the weight of their connection lingered, unspoken but undeniably present. As the days turned into weeks, the memory of that night lingered in the corners of Mia's mind, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Every time Daniel walked into the room, her pulse quickened, her thoughts clouded with guilt and longing. He avoided her gaze when her mother was around, but when they were alone, the tension between them was suffocating. Mia tried to focus on her studies, her friends, anything to distract herself from the growing weight of their secret. But no matter how hard she tried, her mind kept returning to him, the way he'd looked at her, the way he'd touched her, the way he'd made her feel alive in a way she hadn't before. One afternoon, Mia came home early from class, the house unusually quiet. She set her bag down and headed toward the kitchen, stopping short when she saw Daniel standing at the sink, his hands gripping the counter. "Hey," she said softly, her voice startling him. He turned, his expression a mix of surprise and hesitation. "You're home early. Class ended early," she said, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" He let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been trying to make sense of everything." Mia hesitated, her heart pounding as she stepped even closer. "Daniel, I can't stop thinking about that night." His gaze snapped to hers, a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. "Mia, don't," he said, his voice low and strained. "We can't do this." "But we already did," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And you can't tell me you don't think about it, too." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Of course I think about it," he admitted. "But that doesn't make it right." The room was thick with tension as Mia reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. "What if we stopped fighting it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Daniel froze at her touch, his breath hitching. "Mia, you don't understand what you're saying." "I do," she insisted, stepping closer until they were mere inches apart. "I know this is complicated, and I know it's wrong, but I also know how I feel, and I know you feel it too." His resolve faltered as her words sank in. "Mia," he whispered, his voice cracking, "this could ruin everything." "Then why are you still standing here?" she asked, her gaze steady. "Why haven't you walked away?" He didn't answer, but the way his hand moved to cup her face said everything she needed to know. His lips met hers in a kiss that was desperate and full of all the emotions they'd been trying to suppress. This time, there was no hesitation, no holding back. They gave in completely, the world outside their secret shattering into nothing. The sunlight streamed through the curtains as Mia stirred, the events of the night before rushing back. She turned to find Daniel already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands.